The millionaire stepped into the dark, damp cellar and found the fragile blind girl chained to the wall. His heart raced as he tried to free her, but something terrible happened. A shocking revelation made him hesitate and changed his destiny forever. If this story has captured your interest, subscribe to our channel to receive all our thrilling tales. Now let's continue. The wet asphalt reflected the glow of the streetlights as Richard Montgomery adjusted the air conditioning in his Mercedes. It had been another exhausting day of meetings at Montgomery Enterprises, the company he had inherited from his father and turned into one of the largest real estate empires in Chicago. Traffic on the Kennedy Expressway was at a complete standstill due to an accident involving two semi-trucks. His driver had called to say he was stuck in the gridlock, so Richard decided to drive himself home that night. The GPS alerted him to an alternate route. Richard hesitated for a moment. The suggested path cut through an old, decaying part of the city's south side. On a normal day, he would never consider passing through there, but he was eager to get home. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel before he decided to take the detour. The streets grew narrower and dimly lit. Abandoned buildings stood like silent sentinels, their broken windows resembling empty eye sockets. The rain began to fall harder, and Richard slowed down, trying to see the road better through the fogged-up windows. It was when he passed an old warehouse that something caught his attention. A faint, flickering light escaped from one of the upper windows. It could have been just a reflection, he thought, but then he heard it, a sound so soft it almost blended with the noise of the rain. A voice, a cry for help. Richard slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. His rational mind told him to keep driving, to not get involved. After all, this wasn't a safe part of the city, especially at this hour. But there was something about that voice that kept him from leaving. He parked his car in a side alley and stepped out, feeling the cold raindrops seep through his Italian suit. The smell of mold and decay was even stronger outside. He approached the warehouse entrance, a heavy, rusted metal door. He tried to open it, but it was locked. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely the voice of a child. His hands trembled as he forced the lock. After a few pushes, the rusted metal gave way with a sharp creak. The inside of the warehouse was plunged in shadows, except for that single faint light coming from the upper floor. The ground was covered in debris and shards of glass that crunched under his expensive shoes. Richard followed the sound, climbing a metal staircase that groaned with every step. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. When he reached the top, it took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to the dim light, and then he saw her. Curled up in a corner on a filthy mattress was a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, partially covering a face marked by yellowing bruises. She wore only an oversized t-shirt that hung loosely on her frail frame, and her wrists were chained to the floor. But it was when she lifted her face toward him that Richard felt his stomach churn. Her eyes, though open, didn't focus on anything. They moved erratically, as if searching for something in the perpetual darkness she lived in. She was blind. "Who's there?" Her voice was a hoarse whisper, filled with fear. Richard took a step forward, trying to find the right words. "Don't be afraid. I'm here to help. My name is—" Before he could finish, a metallic clang echoed through the warehouse. The door downstairs was being closed. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs, and an acrid smell began to fill the air. Smoke. Panic gripped Richard as he realized he was locked inside. He ran to the stairs, but flames were already licking the lower steps. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming the old wood and accumulated debris. The girl began to cough violently, curling up even tighter. Richard looked around desperately, searching for a way out. The windows were too high, and the only staircase was being devoured by the fire. The heat grew more intense with each second, and the smoke made the air almost unbreathable. That's when he noticed a loose piece of metal near the wall. He ran to it and, using all his strength, began to strike the chains binding the girl. The old metal finally gave way after several attempts, but time was running out. The flames had reached the upper floor, and the ceiling began to crack dangerously. Richard picked up the girl in his arms, surprised by how light she was. Her body trembled, but she made no sound. They needed to get out immediately, but how? The flames blocked the only exit, and the heat was becoming unbearable. That's when he noticed a section of the wall that seemed weaker, where the old structure showed cracks. It was their only chance. He set the girl down for a moment and, ignoring the pain in his hands, began to strike the wall with the same piece of metal he had used to free her. The fire drew closer, and the air grew too thick to breathe. The girl coughed uncontrollably, and Richard could feel his own strength fading. But he couldn't give up, not now. With one last desperate strike, part of the wall finally gave way, opening a narrow passage to the rainy night. Richard picked up the girl again and, shielding her as much as he could, managed to squeeze through the opening. The cold night air hit his face like a slap, but even the polluted air of Chicago had never smelled so sweet. They had escaped. Richard carried the girl away from the burning warehouse, her small body trembling in his arms. The rain fell harder now, soaking them both. As he moved, he noticed a shadowy figure watching from a distance, standing under the faint glow of a street lamp. For a moment, their eyes met, and then the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of unease and fear. Richard hurried to his car, shielding the girl from the rain as best he could. She was shaking violently, whether from the cold or fear, likely both. Once inside the vehicle, he turned on the heater and removed his soaked coat, draping it over her. Under the car's interior light, he could finally see her condition more clearly. The girl's face was marked not only by recent bruises, but also by older scars. Her thin arms bore the marks of the chains, and her bare feet were cut and bruised. Her long dark hair was matted, as if it hadn't been brushed in weeks. But it was her eyes that stood out the most, milky blue, moving aimlessly, lost in their permanent darkness. "What's your name?" Richard asked gently, trying not to frighten her further. The girl hesitated, clutching the coat tightly. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How old are you, Emily?" 9. Her voice was hoarse, likely from the smoke they had inhaled. Richard grabbed a water bottle from the glove compartment and helped her drink. She gulped it down eagerly, as if she hadn't had clean water in days. "I need to take you to a hospital," he said, already starting the car. "No." Her cry startled him. Emily grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Please, I can't go to the hospital. They'll find me." "Who will find you? Who did this to you?" The girl began to tremble even more, shaking her head. "I can't say. They told me if I talked." Her voice broke and tears streamed down her bruised face. Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. Years of handling tough business deals hadn't prepared him for something like this. He should go straight to the police. That was the right thing to do. But something about the desperation in this child made him hesitate. "Do you have family? Someone we can contact?" Emily was silent for a long moment. "I can't go back," she finally murmured. "It's not safe." Richard glanced at the warehouse through the rearview mirror. The flames now consumed the entire building, and in the distance, he could hear the sirens of approaching fire. Trucks. He needed to leave before they arrived. But where could he go? It was then that Emily said something that sent a chill down his spine. A name. Just one name, spoken between sobs. Dr. Henry Miller. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He knew that name well. Dr. Henry Miller was one of Chicago's most respected pediatric ophthalmologists. But that wasn't all. He was also a board member at Montgomery Enterprises, personally appointed by Richard's father years ago. How do you know that name?" Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was there, when it happened." Emily shrank further into the seat. "He said he was going to cure me, that he was going to make me see again, but he... Her voice failed her again, lost in memories too painful to put into words. Richard tried to gather his thoughts. Dr. Miller was a pillar of Chicago society. A philanthropist, always present at charity events, his clinic was renowned for treating children with visual impairments. How could he be involved in something so horrific? The sound of sirens grew closer. Richard made a decision. He couldn't take Emily to his penthouse in Lincoln Park. It would be the first place they'd look. For her. He needed a safe place, somewhere he could buy time to figure out what was going on. He remembered an apartment he kept under one of his company's names, used occasionally to host important clients. No one except his accountant knew about the property. For now, it would be the safest place. As he drove through the now deserted streets of Chicago, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what he had uncovered. If Dr. Miller was truly involved, this was much bigger than he had imagined. The doctor had connections to some of the city's most influential families, including his own. Emily had fallen asleep, still clutching the coat as if it were her only protection in the world. Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror and felt something strange in his chest. Throughout his adult life, he had dedicated himself entirely to his business, building an empire even larger than his father's. He had never had time for family, for lasting relationships. His life was the company. But now, looking at this wounded, frightened child, something inside him was changing. For the first time in years, money and power seemed insignificant. There was something bigger at stake. Something that made him question everything he had ever believed in. His phone buzzed, startling him. It was a number he recognized, Dr. Miller's clinic. Richard declined the call, his heart racing. How did they already know? Who was that figure who had watched them at the warehouse? And most importantly, how deep did this conspiracy go? He looked at Emily again and made a silent promise. No matter what happened, no matter who was involved, he would protect her. Even if it meant facing people he once considered friends. Even if it meant risking everything he had built. The apartment in the West Loop was exactly as Richard had left it months ago. Furniture covered with white sheets, a thin layer of dust on every surface, the air heavy with the scent of a long-closed space. He carried Emily, still asleep, to the guest room and laid her gently on the bed. Even in her sleep, her face held a look of worry, as if peace eluded her even in dreams. Richard opened the windows, letting in the cool night air. The rain had eased into a light drizzle, typical of Chicago. His clothes were still damp and his muscles ached from the effort of escaping the burning warehouse. But there was no time to rest. He needed to act fast. First, he called Anthony, his most trusted security officer. It was 3 a.m, but the man answered on the second ring. "I need you to come to the address I'm about to send you. Bring clean clothes, food, and a first aid kit. And Anthony, don't tell anyone, not even my secretary." While he waited, Richard tried to organize his thoughts. How was Dr. Miller involved in this? What had they been doing to Emily in that warehouse? And why had they tried to kill them? Each question led to more disturbing answers. A moan from the guest room interrupted his thoughts. Emily was having a nightmare, thrashing in the bed. Richard rushed to her, trying to calm her down. "It's okay, you're safe now." She woke with a start, her hands groping the air for something familiar. Where am I?" "Somewhere safe," Richard replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "No one's going to hurt you here." Emily took a deep breath, seeming to orient herself through the sounds and smells of the room. Her fingers touched the clean sheets, then found Richard's arm. "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. Why was he risking so much for a stranger? "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered simply. "The other people, they said they wanted to help too." Her voice trembled. "The doctor said he was going to make me see again. He said it was a special experimental treatment. My mum, she believed him." Richard felt his heart tighten. "Your mum, where is she now?" Emily's face twisted in deep pain. "She disappeared. After they took me to the clinic, I never saw her again. They said she abandoned me, that she didn't want me anymore because I was blind." Tears began to stream down her face. "But that's not true. My mum would never do that. She loved me." The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Richard checked the peephole. It was Anthony, carrying 2 large bags. After making sure no one had followed him, Richard opened the door. Anthony was a tall, strong man, a former police officer who had worked for Richard for over a decade. His eyes widened at the sight of his boss's condition and, more importantly, the bruised girl in the bed. "Boss, what's going on? You need a doctor?" "No." Emily's voice came out in a panicked scream. "You can't call a doctor. They'll find me." Richard gestured for Anthony to calm down. "It's okay, I just need you to keep watch and let me know if you notice anything suspicious. And Anthony, this can't leak." "Understood." The security guard nodded, though. His expression showed concern. After he left to patrol the building, Richard began tending to Emily's injuries. There were deep marks on her wrists where the chains had bound her, and several bruises across her body. Using the first aid kit, he cleaned and bandaged her wounds, as carefully as he could. "You must be hungry," he said, noticing how thin she was. "Anthony brought food. Want a sandwich?" Emily nodded timidly. As she ate, her movements were hesitant, as if she wasn't used to feeding herself. "In the warehouse, they only gave me soup, once a day, sometimes less." Richard felt anger rise in his chest. How could anyone be so cruel to a child? "How long were you there?" "I'm not sure. After the experiments didn't work, they took me from the hospital to there. They said it was temporary, until they found another solution." She stopped eating, her hands trembling. "There were other noises too, other voices, other cries, I think it wasn't just me." A chill ran down Richard's spine. Other children? This was even worse than he had imagined. Dr. Miller wasn't acting alone. There was an entire organization behind this. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. "I know what you did. Tomorrow 10 a.m. Grant Park. Come alone or the girl suffers the consequences." Richard looked at Emily, who had fallen asleep again. Whoever was behind this had eyes everywhere. How had they found out so quickly? Were there cameras in the warehouse? Or was someone very close to him involved? The night wore on, and with it grew the sense that he had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. His business empire, his reputation, everything was at risk. But looking at this fragile, wounded girl, he knew there was no turning back. He would see this through, no matter the cost. The sun had barely risen when Richard woke with a start in the armchair of the guest room. He had dozed off for a few hours, exhausted from the events of the previous night. Emily was still asleep, her breathing now more even. Anthony knocked softly on the door, handing Richard a manila envelope. "Got what you asked for," Anthony whispered. But it wasn't easy. The clinic's files are well protected. Richard opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a medical record with Emily's name, Emily Carter, dated 6 months ago. The photo showed a different girl, healthier, with a faint smile on her face despite her unfocused eyes. The initial diagnosis indicated a rare degenerative retinal disease that had left her blind by the age of 7. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note in the margin of the document, Project Light, Phase 2. Next to it was a signature he knew well, Dr. Henry Miller. Anger surged in Richard's chest as he thought of the doctor, a man he had once admired using sick children as test subjects. "Uncle Richard?" Emily's soft voice pulled him back to the present. It was the first time she had called him that. "Is someone here?" "Just Anthony," he replied, quickly tucking the documents away. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, sitting up in bed, her fingers brushing lightly over the bandages on her wrists. "But I'm scared. They won't stop looking for me." Richard checked his watch, 8:30 a.m. In less than 2 hours he would have to meet the person who had sent the threatening text. He knew it was a trap, but what choice did he have? "Emily," he began gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I need you to tell me more about what happened, about your mom, about how you ended up in that clinic." The girl hugged her knees, as if trying to shield herself from the memories. "We lived in Evanston. After I went blind, Mom did everything she could to help me. She worked 2 jobs, saved every penny." Her voice faltered. "That's when we met Dr. Miller. He came to the special school I went to, saying he had a new experimental treatment. He promised he could make me see again." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "And your mom believed him?" "Everyone did. He was famous, always on TV talking about helping kids. Mom sold our apartment, took out loans. He said the treatment was expensive, but it would be worth it. Emily wiped a tear. At first, it was just regular checkups. Then the procedures started. It hurt so much, but he said it was normal, that it was part of the process. When was the last time you saw your mum? After one of the surgeries. I was dizzy, in so much pain. I heard her arguing with someone, screaming that she was going to expose everything. Then just silence. Emily began to tremble. They told me she left, that she couldn't handle having a broken daughter anymore. But I know that's a lie. My mum would never abandon me. Richard felt his heart ache. The disappearance of Emily's mother couldn't be a coincidence. What had Dr. Miller and his associates done to her? A noise from the living room interrupted their conversation. Anthony entered hurriedly. "Boss, there's a suspicious car parked on the corner. Tinted windows, no plates." Richard looked at his watch again. 9:15. Time was running out. He couldn't leave Emily alone, but he also couldn't ignore the message. If he didn't show up at the meeting, the consequences could be dire. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "You got her medical file, didn't you? Interesting how some people are too curious for their own good. Ask her about room 17. Ask her, what happened to the other kids?" Emily paled at the mention of room 17. Her entire body began to shake violently. "No, I don't want to remember. Please." "What happened in that room?" Richard asked softly, holding her hands. "You can tell me. I'm here to protect you." "It's where they did the tests." Her voice was barely a whisper. "There were other kids, too. I couldn't see them, but I heard the screams. One day they took Juliana. She shared a room with me at the clinic. She never came back. They said the treatment worked, that she went home. But I heard when—" Emily couldn't finish. Her body was racked with uncontrollable sobs. Richard held her, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. How much suffering had they caused these children? How many lives had been destroyed in the name of this so-called treatment? The clock read 9:30. In half an hour he would have to face whoever was behind those messages. But now he was even more certain. He wasn't just protecting one girl. He was uncovering a sinister scheme that needed to be exposed, no matter who was involved. Grant Park was nearly empty at that hour of the morning. The fine drizzle, typical of Chicago, created a melancholic mist among the century-old trees. Richard had left Emily in Anthony's care, with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone, no matter who it was. His footsteps echoed on the wet pavement as he walked through the park. Every shadow, every sudden movement of the leaves made him jump. The clock struck exactly 10 a.m. when he spotted a figure sitting on one of the more secluded benches. As he approached, he immediately recognized the woman, Sandra Myers, head nurse at Dr. Miller's clinic. She maintained the same rigid posture as always, but there was something different in her eyes. Fear. "I thought you were smarter, Richard," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You should have left the girl where she was." "Where? You were torturing her, you mean?" The anger in his voice was palpable. "What were you doing to her in that place? And where is her mother?" Sandra looked around nervously. "You don't understand. This is bigger than all of us. Project Light. It wasn't supposed to be like this at first. It was meant to really help the kids." "What kind of help?" "Involves torturing innocent children." Richard clenched his fists. "And what happened to Juliana and the other kids in room 17? The nurse paled at the mention of room 17. "How do you—" She took a deep breath, seeming to make a difficult decision. "Listen, we don't have much time. They're coming here now. Take this." She slid a flash drive across the bench. "It's all there. Records, videos, files. The truth about what really happened at the clinic. Why are you helping me now?" "Because I can't sleep anymore," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "The screams of the children. They don't stop. Juliana was just the first. Then there were others. So many others. When I questioned Dr. Miller, he said they were unavoidable side effects, that medical progress required sacrifices." Richard picked up the flash drive, his mind reeling from the implications of her revelations. And Emily's mother. She found out the truth. She saw documents she wasn't supposed to see, threatened to expose everything. Sandra wiped her tears. She had an accident on I-90. Her car was never found. The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Murder. They had killed Emily's mother to cover their crimes. "There's one more thing you need to know," Sandra continued, her voice now almost inaudible. "The funding for Project Light, some of it comes from Montgomery Enterprises. Your father, he knew everything." Richard felt the world spin. His father, who had passed away 2 years ago, was involved in this monstrous scheme. Was that why Dr. Miller had so much power within the company? A black car sped into the park. Sandra stood abruptly. "They're here. You need to go, now." "Come with me," Richard insisted. "We can protect you." She shook her head. "It's too late for me, but not for that girl. Save her, Richard, and expose the truth." Richard began to run as 2 men in suits got out of the car. He heard shouts, then a muffled sound. When he reached the park's exit, he looked back. Sandra was gone, and so was the black car. He returned to his car with his heart pounding in his chest. The flash drive weighed heavily in his pocket. Sandra's revelations had changed everything. This wasn't just a case of illegal medical experiments. It was a conspiracy that involved his own family. His phone rang. It was Anthony. "Boss, something's wrong. Someone tried to break into the apartment. I stopped them, but they know where we are. We need to get the girl out of here." Richard sped through the morning traffic, his mind racing. Sandra's words echoed in his head. His father knew. His father had allowed these atrocities to happen. How many other families had been destroyed? How many other children like Emily had suffered in the name of that diabolical project? And now, with Sandra's disappearance, he was the only one who could expose the truth. But first, he needed to keep Emily alive. They wouldn't stop until they found her. And now that he knew the extent of their power, he understood that nowhere in Chicago would be safe for long. Richard arrived at the apartment to find Anthony on high alert. The door showed clear signs of a forced entry, and the security guard had a shallow cut on his arm. Emily was huddled in the bedroom, trembling. "There were 2 men," Anthony reported in a low voice. "Professionals. If it weren't for my police training—" He left the sentence hanging, the implication clear. Richard quickly grabbed a backpack and began packing essentials. They needed to leave immediately. As he did, he noticed Emily clutching something to her chest, a small worn music box. "It was in the pocket of my shirt," she explained, sensing his gaze. "It's the only thing I have left of my mom. She gave it to me on my last birthday before—" Her voice broke. Richard knelt beside her. "I found out about your mom, Emily." The words felt heavy as they left his mouth. "Sandra, the nurse, she told me what happened." Emily froze, her fingers tightening around the music box. She's... "Yes," Richard said gently, his heart breaking as silent tears streamed down the girl's face. "She never abandoned. She tried to save you." Emily opened the music box. A soft, melancholic melody filled the room. "She always said music was like light for the blind, that even in the dark we could find beauty." Her fingers traced the edge of the box. "It was the last thing she said to me before the surgery, that it didn't matter if I never saw again because I had music in my heart." The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted the moment. Anthony quickly drew his weapon, but it was just the noise of neighbors passing by. Still, the fear in Emily's eyes was unmistakable. "We need to go," Richard said, carefully placing the music box in the backpack. "I know a place where we'll be safe, at least for now." As they drove out of the city, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the flash drive Sandra had given him. He needed to see its contents, to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. But more than anything, he needed to protect Emily. They drove for nearly 2 hours, leaving the city behind. Their destination was an old family estate near Lake Geneva, a place Richard hadn't visited since his mother's death over 15 years ago. The property was practically abandoned, with only an elderly caretaker who came twice a week for basic maintenance. Richard knew it wasn't a permanent solution, but he needed time to think, to plan his next move. While Anthony checked the perimeter of the property, Richard set up a room for Emily. The girl was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. After eating a little, she fell asleep to the sound of her music box. Finally alone, Richard plugged the flash drive into his laptop. What he found made his stomach churn. There were hundreds of files, organized by dates and names. Videos of experimental procedures, detailed reports, financial records. The cruelty was systematic, documented with clinical precision. One file in particular caught his attention. Project Light, Phase 3. Opening it, he discovered something even more disturbing. The project wasn't just about curing blindness. It was about something far more sinister. The children weren't just patients, they were test subjects for neural stimulation experiments. Dr. Miller believed that by manipulating certain areas of the brain, he could not only restore vision, but enhance human perception. The results were devastating: seizures, permanent brain damage, accidental deaths. And his father. There were emails between him and Dr. Miller. The funding wasn't just institutional, it was personal. His father had believed these experiments could lead to revolutionary medical breakthroughs. He was willing to overlook the side effects in the name of progress. Richard closed the laptop, feeling physically and mentally sick. How could his own father have been part of something like this? How could so many people have turned a blind eye to so much suffering? A scream from Emily's room jolted him from his thoughts. He rushed in to find her sitting up in bed, drenched in cold sweat. "They were there again," she whispered, trembling. "In my dream. Room 17. The voices," Juliana screaming. Richard held her, feeling her small body shake against his chest. "It's okay now. No one's going to hurt you anymore, I promise." But as he rocked her back to sleep, he knew it was a promise that would be hard to keep. Dr. Miller's power and influence were immense. And now, with Sandra's disappearance, he would be even more cautious, even more dangerous. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. On the porch of the estate, Anthony stood guard, a silent shadow against the twilight. Night was falling, bringing with it the darkness that terrified Emily so much. But for Richard, the real darkness was in the documents on that flash drive. In the cruelty they revealed, and most of all in the weight of the truth about his own family. The next morning arrived cold and foggy at the estate. Richard hadn't slept, spending the night alternating between watching over Emily and examining the files on the flash drive. Each new discovery was more disturbing than the last. He found a folder containing records of all the children who had gone through the treatment, dozens of them, some marked with a simple red X, those who hadn't survived. Others labeled Phase 3 inconclusive, which he now knew meant permanent brain damage. Among them, Juliana's name stood out with a special note: adverse reaction, elimination required. Uncle Richard. Emily's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood in the doorway, her fingers brushing the wall for orientation. "I smell coffee." He quickly closed the laptop. "Anthony made breakfast. You must be hungry." As he helped her to the kitchen table, he noticed how much calmer she seemed in this environment. Her fingers explored the old wooden table, her face softening as she felt the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window. "This place reminds me of home," she said softly, holding a mug of hot chocolate. "It smells like old wood, like Grandma's house in Evanston." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Amid all the horror, it was easy to forget that Emily was just a child who had lost everything: her sight, her mother, her childhood. "Do you remember your home well? What your life was like before?" "Before I went blind," she finished, a sad smile on her lips. "I remember everything. The colors are the hardest part to hold on to. Mom had a garden full of yellow flowers, daisies, I think. And my room was light blue like the summer sky." Her voice faltered. "When I started losing my sight, it happened slowly. First the colors got blurry, then the shapes. Mom read to me every night, even after I couldn't see the pictures in the books anymore. She said I needed to keep the stories in my heart." The sound of tires on the gravel driveway interrupted their conversation. Anthony, who had been on the porch, came in quickly. "Boss, there's a car approaching." Richard felt his blood run cold. How had they been found so quickly? "Emily, stay with Anthony. I'll check it out." But before he could reach the door, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. It was Clara Montgomery, his aunt, his father's younger sister. "Richard, are you here? The caretaker called me saying there was activity at the house." He hesitated. Aunt Clara had always been different from the rest of the family, more sensitive, more human. When his mother died, it was Clara who had taken care of him, who had shielded him from his father's harshness. "Who is it?" Emily asked, clutching Anthony's hand. "My aunt," Richard replied, still unsure. "I think we can trust her." He opened the door to find Clara standing on the porch, her face etched with worry. At 65, she still carried the same quiet elegance she always had, but there was something different in her eyes, as if she bore an invisible weight. "My God, Richard, what's going on?" "The board is in an uproar." Dr. Miller called an emergency meeting. "They're saying you kidnapped a patient from the clinic and—" She stopped when she saw Emily, who had quietly approached the door. Her face paled. "You—" Clara brought a hand to her mouth. "You found out, didn't you, about the project?" Richard felt the ground disappear beneath him. "You knew. All this time you knew what was happening at that clinic." Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Tears streamed down her face. "I tried to stop it, Richard, when I found out what your father and Henry were doing, but they were too powerful. No one would have believed me." Emily reached out, her hand brushing Clara's face. "You cried the day of my surgery," she said softly. "I couldn't see, but I heard you. You said you were sorry." Clara took Emily's hand, sobbing. "I should have done more. I should have spoken out, no matter the consequences. But they threatened my family, said they'd destroy everyone I loved." "And now?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "Did you come to turn us in?" "No." Clara straightened, wiping her tears. "I came to help. Sandra, she reached out to me yesterday before she disappeared. She told me she'd given you the evidence. Richard, they'll do anything to silence you. Dr. Miller has already called in favors with the government, with the police. Within hours you'll be accused of kidnapping and the girl—" She didn't finish the sentence. Richard looked at Emily, so small and fragile, yet with an inner strength that surprised him at every turn. He couldn't fail her. He couldn't let those monsters get to her again. "There's a place," Clara said, lowering her voice. "A house on the coast, in a small town. No one knows about it. Not even your father did. It was your mother's refuge where she went when things got too hard. A refuge, a place where they could hide while they planned their next move." But Richard knew it wasn't that simple. Dr. Miller and his associates wouldn't give up easily, and now with Clara's revelations, he understood that he was up against something even bigger than he had imagined. The drive to the coastal town was tense and quiet. Clara insisted on taking them in her own car. It would be less suspicious than Richard's vehicle, which was undoubtedly being monitored. Anthony followed in another car, keeping a safe distance to avoid drawing attention. Emily slept in the back seat, her head resting on a makeshift pillow. The music box lay in her lap, her fingers occasionally brushing its worn surface, as if to reassure herself it was still there. "Did my mum spend a lot of time at this house?" Richard asked. Clara breaking the silence. Clara kept her eyes on the road, but her hands tightened on the steering wheel, especially in her last years. "Helena, she found out things about your father, about the company, things that destroyed her from the inside." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Her accident. It wasn't an accident, was it?" "Your father said she was unstable, that she imagined conspiracies." Clara swallowed hard. "But I knew your mother, Richard. She wasn't crazy. She was too sensitive for the cruel world we lived in, like that girl back there." The rest of the drive was punctuated only by the soft sound of Emily's breathing and the distant roar of the approaching ocean. After nearly 3 hours, Clara turned onto a dirt road that wound through a sparsely populated area of the coastline. The house emerged from the trees like a mirage, a simple yet elegant structure, clearly designed to blend into the natural surroundings. The ocean could be seen in the distance, its waves crashing against the rocks. "No one's been here in years," Clara explained as she opened the dusty windows. "Helena left the property in my name, in secret. Not even the family lawyers know it exists." Emily woke to the sound of the waves, her unfocused eyes turned toward the noise. "Is that the ocean?" she asked. a small smile forming on her lips. "I've never heard it so close before." Richard helped her out of the car, watching as she instinctively turned her face to feel the salty breeze. For a moment, she seemed like any other child, discovering something new and wondrous. But the peace didn't last long. Clara's phone buzzed, making everyone jump. It was a voicemail from Sandra. "Clara, if you're hearing this, something's happened to me." The nurse's voice was shaky, hurried. "There's more about Project Light you need to know. It wasn't just about the blind children. Miller, he was developing something bigger. The experiments, the neural stimulation, it was all a test. He discovered something in those children's brains, something that..." The message cut off abruptly. Clara looked at Richard, her face pale. "This came in last night. I tried calling back, but the number was already deactivated." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. What else was Dr. Miller hiding? What had he discovered that justified such cruelty? Emily approached, her fingers finding Richard's hand. "There's something I never told you," she said softly. "Something that happened in room 17, after the procedures sometimes. Sometimes I saw things, not like before, not normal images. They were like dreams, but I was awake. I saw places I'd never been, and sometimes..." She hesitated, trembling slightly. "Sometimes I saw what the other children were thinking." The silence that followed her revelation was broken only by the sound of the waves. Clara brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. Richard tried to process what he'd just heard. Was it possible that Miller's experiments had created some kind of unexpected side effect? "That's why they kept me alive," Emily continued, her voice barely a whisper. "The others who developed the same ability didn't last long. But with me it was different. I could control it, could choose when to use it. They wanted to understand how." Anthony, who had arrived quietly, interrupted the conversation. "Boss, there's strange activity on the main road. Several black cars, looks like they're sweeping the area." Richard exchanged a worried glance with Clara. Could they have been followed? The house was practically invisible from the road, but for how long? "There's a basement," Clara said quickly. "Helena used it as an office. It's well hidden. We can take shelter there if we need to." As they helped Emily inside, Richard thought about the revelations he'd just heard. Dr. Miller wasn't just trying to cure blindness. He was trying to create something more, something that pushed the boundaries of ethics and human nature. And Emily, this small girl who had already suffered so much, carried within her the result of those monstrous experiments. An ability others would kill to possess or to keep secret. The basement was surprisingly cozy. Bookshelves lined the walls, and an old wooden desk occupied one corner. The smell of salt air mingled with the scent of aged paper. Clara lit a few lanterns, casting a soft glow over the room. "Helena spent hours down here," Clara said, running her hand over the dusty desk, writing in her notebooks, organizing documents. She said she had to record everything, that one day the truth would need to come out. Richard examined the shelves, finding folders meticulously organized by date. His mother had always been methodical, a trait he'd inherited. But what had she been investigating so carefully? Emily sat in an old armchair, her fingers exploring the worn fabric. "Someone's crying," she said suddenly, her voice distant. "Upstairs. A woman. She's so scared." Richard and Clara exchanged alarmed looks. There was no one. Upstairs, Anthony had checked the entire house. Then Richard understood. "You're seeing memories from here." Emily nodded slowly. "It's like an echo. I can feel what she felt when she was in this place. The woman, your mom, she found something terrible, something that was eating her up inside." Clara opened a drawer in the desk that seemed stuck. Inside, she found a black notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Helena's elegant handwriting filled each page with detailed notes. "My God," Clara whispered as she read. "Project Light. It existed longer than we thought." Helena discovered that in the 1980s, Miller was involved in secret research at the university, experiments on brain stimulation in orphaned children. Richard felt his stomach turn. "What do you mean?" According to these notes, he developed a theory about extrasensory perception. He believed the human brain had untapped abilities that could be awakened through specific procedures. Blind children were perfect targets. Their brains had already developed alternative ways of perceiving the world. Emily hugged her arms, shivering. He said we were special, that our brains were different, that we could be the key to something bigger. The sound of engines upstairs interrupted their conversation. Anthony came down the stairs quickly. 3 cars stopped at the entrance. Armed men are surrounding the house. Clara quickly tucked the notebook into her bag. There's a passage, she whispered. Helena had an emergency exit built. It leads to a trail that goes down to the beach. Richard picked up Emily. The girl was trembling, but remained strangely calm. They're angry, she murmured. I can feel it, especially him. Dr. Miller is here. Heavy footsteps echoed upstairs. Men's voices barked orders. Doors were slammed open violently. Clara guided the group to a nearly invisible panel in the back wall of the basement. The old mechanism creaked softly as it opened, revealing a narrow tunnel. Anthony, go first, Richard ordered. Clara, right behind him. I'll bring up the rear with Emily. They had barely entered the tunnel when they heard the basement door being kicked open. Dr. Miller's voice, which Richard knew so well from countless board meetings, sounded strangely distorted by rage. They can't have gone far. The girl is the key to everything. Years of research, decades of work. I won't let them destroy this now. The group moved slowly through the damp tunnel. Emily clung tightly to Richard's neck, her face buried in his shoulder. Suddenly, she tensed. He's remembering, she whispered. He's thinking about all the other children, about Juliana. She developed the same abilities as me, but she couldn't control them. She saw too much, felt too much. Her brain couldn't handle it. Richard felt hot tears soak his shirt. The suffering of this child, the weight of the memories she carried, not just her own but those of all the other victims of that monstrous project, was almost unbearable. The tunnel began to slope upward. The sound of the ocean grew louder, mixed now with the noise of the rain that had started to fall. Behind them, voices and footsteps echoed closer. Dr. Miller and his men had found the passage. Clara stopped suddenly. There's a fork here. The tunnel splits in 2. They're going to catch us, Emily said, her voice trembling. They're too close. And Dr. Miller, he won't stop. Never. Not while I'm alive. Richard held the girl tighter, feeling a fierce determination grow in his chest. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let them take her back. He wouldn't let any more children suffer at that monster's hands. But as the sound of their pursuers grew closer, a cruel doubt consumed him. Where could they run when every path seemed to lead to darkness? The rain poured down as the group finally emerged from the tunnel. They were in a small cove surrounded by dark rocks. The turbulent sea sent violent waves crashing against the shore, and the wind carried salty spray in sharp gusts. This way, Clara said, pointing to a narrow trail that climbed the cliffside. There's a fishing village a few kilometers away. We can find help there. But before they could reach the trail, Emily grabbed Richard's arm with surprising strength. They split up, she whispered, her face contorted in concentration. There are men coming from both sides of the beach. Richard looked around, desperate. They were trapped between the sea and the rocks. The only way out was up the steep, slippery trail. Anthony, you and Clara go first, Richard decided. Take Emily, I'll try to delay them. No, Emily clung to him fiercely. I can't leave you, they'll hurt you like they hurt my mom. A thunderclap split the sky, and flashlight beams began to appear at both ends of the beach. Dr. Miller's voice carried over the sound of the waves. It's over, Richard! Be reasonable. You don't understand the importance of what we've discovered. What this girl represents, it's bigger than all of us. Clara took Emily's hand. Come on, sweetheart. Richard knows what he's doing. But the girl didn't move. Wait, Emily said, her voice strangely calm. There's something in your mum's memories, something important. Her unfocused eyes darted rapidly, as if reading an invisible book. The notebook. There's a hidden page. She sewed it into the cover. Clara quickly opened her bag and pulled out Helena's notebook. With trembling fingers, she found a small tear in the seam of the cover. Inside was a carefully folded piece of paper. It was an old photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of doctors in front of an old building. In the center of the image, a young Dr. Miller stood smiling, next to a man Richard recognized immediately, his grandfather, the founder of Montgomery Enterprises. "There's writing on the back," Clara said, flipping the photo over. Helena's handwriting was hurried, unlike her meticulous notes in the notebook. The project was never about a cure. It's about control. Miller discovered something at St. Joseph's Orphanage in 1982, a child who could see beyond their eyes. He spent decades trying to replicate that first success. Augusto funded it all in secret, using the company as a front. The original files are in the vault at the old headquarters. The code is her birth date, the first child. Richard felt his heart race. The old Montgomery Enterprises headquarters, the building his father had abandoned years ago but never sold, the place where it all began. "Uncle Richard," Emily's voice brought him back to the present. "They're almost here. But there's something else. Something your mom wanted you to know." She reached out, gently touching his face. She could see things too, like me. That's how she found out everything, and that's why... A gunshot rang out, ricocheting off the rocks nearby. Anthony quickly pulled everyone behind a large boulder. "Miller's losing control," Emily said, trembling. "His thoughts, they're so dark, he doesn't care about keeping secrets anymore. He just wants..." She stopped, horrified. "He's going to kill us all, like he killed the others who found out the truth." The rain intensified, turning the trail into a slippery mudslide. The flashlight beams drew closer from both sides of the beach. In minutes, they would be completely surrounded. "There's a boat," Emily said suddenly. "Over there." She pointed to a small inlet between the rocks. "I can hear the ropes hitting the mast." Richard strained to see through the curtain of rain and spotted the silhouette of a small fishing boat anchored near the rocks. It was risky. The sea was too rough for a vessel that size. But what choice did they have? "All of you, get to the boat," Richard said, handing the flash drive to Clara. "I need to finish this. I need to get to those files." "No," Emily said firmly, gripping his hand. "I'm not leaving you. I already lost my mum. I can't lose you too." Another shot rang out, closer this time. The flashlights converged on their position. Time was running out. "If we split up, they'll have to do the same," Richard argued. "It's our only chance." But looking at this brave girl who had already endured so much and still held on to her humanity, Richard felt his resolve waver. How could he leave her now? The sound of footsteps on the wet sand grew louder. Dr. Miller shouted orders to his men. The storm roared overhead, as if the sky itself was protesting the cruelty this man had inflicted on so many innocent children. It was Emily who made the decision for them all. Still holding Richard's hand, she turned toward the direction of Dr. Miller's voice. "You're afraid," she said, her voice clear and strong over the noise of the storm. "So afraid you can't even think straight. Afraid they'll find out your first success was an accident, that you've never been able to replicate what happened at that orphanage." The silence that followed her words was broken only by the rain and the waves. The flashlight beams stopped moving. "How do you..." Dr. Miller's voice trembled for the first time. "How can you know that?" "I can see everything now," Emily continued. "All the memories, all the secrets. The first girl didn't survive your experiments, did she? And ever since, you've been desperately trying to find another like her, using blind children, manipulating their brains, destroying their minds." Richard watched, stunned, as the small girl who had needed so much protection now faced her tormentor with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. "You're surrounded, Richard," Dr. Miller shouted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "There's no way out." "He's right," Emily said, speaking for Richard. "There's no way out, not for you, because now I can see everything, every experiment, every death, every attempt to cover up your crimes, and I'm not alone." As if responding to a silent command, other voices began to echo in the darkness. Children's voices, whispering names, dates, places. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. What is that?" One of Miller's men lowered his flashlight, looking around in fear. "It's them," Emily said. "All the children you hurt, all the lives you destroyed. They never really left. Their memories, their stories, they've been stored here." She touched her temple. "And now they want everyone to know the truth." Richard saw through the rain how the men who had surrounded them began to back away, unnerved by the whispers that seemed to penetrate their minds. Even Dr. Miller took a few steps back. "Impossible," he muttered. "The procedure never worked completely. You can't—" "But it did," Emily interrupted. "Just not the way you expected. You wanted to create superhumans, people who could see beyond normal limits. But what you got was something very different. We became keepers of memories of the truths you tried to bury." Clara, standing beside Richard, pulled out a phone. "It's live," she said. "To all my contacts in the press, every word, every confession." That was the final blow. Dr. Miller staggered as if he'd been punched. His men, already shaken by the mysterious whispers, began to disperse across the dark beach. "Arrest them!" Miller shouted, but no one obeyed. "You can't let them escape. The project eats all the work." "It's over," Emily said softly. "You won't hurt anyone else." As if responding to her words, a particularly strong wave crashed against the rocks, sending icy water over everyone. When the water receded, Dr. Miller was on his knees in the sand, decades of secrets and crimes finally weighing him down. Richard picked up Emily, shielding her as much as he could. The effort of channeling all those memories, all those voices, had taken its toll. She trembled in his arms, exhausted. "You did it," he whispered. "You set them free. All of them." "No," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did it. You gave me the strength to face him, to not be afraid anymore." In the distance, sirens began to wail. Clara had alerted the authorities as soon as the live stream began, but Richard barely heard them. He was focused on the small girl in his arms, the child who had shown more courage and strength than any adult he had ever known. The rain began to ease, and through the dissipating clouds the first rays of morning sunlight broke through, a new light rising after the deepest darkness.